Hello and welcome to everyone who's with us today, wherever you are. It's great to have you joining us for this discussion. In particular, thank you to our three panelists, who I will introduce in just a moment, for taking the time to discuss the topic of publishing in Africa. A high-level and ambitious goal of One Day Africa is to help promote a self-sufficient medical system on the African continent. One of the primary ways we see ourselves making progress on this task is by helping early career medical researchers. As a result, since our start at the beginning of the year, we have aimed to engage with various student groups to gain a sense of the struggles they face. From these discussions, a recurring topic has always been publishing research. Many students in their final year of undergrad studies are tasked with doing a research project that some would then like to publish, while graduate students usually need to publish research as a part of their dissertation or thesis requirements. Thus, it is key that young researchers get the hang of publishing if they are to advance quickly in their careers. However, this also raises a number of questions and issues which we aim to discuss today. The primary question being whether or not African researchers should look to publish on the continent or in international publications. Some considerations for this question may be the visibility of their work after publication, the relative prestige between publications, and the relative ease of acceptance. We hope that by hosting this discussion today, we will help researchers make more informed choices next time they are faced with these considerations. Finally, as with all situations that affect the next generation of researchers, soon it will affect the African medical community as a whole. We also hope to bring to light the impact of the possible publication strategies on the broader medical system. The panelists lending their deep insights on the topic tonight are, firstly, Dr. Ejme Ibrahim. Dr. Ibrahim is a physician with postgraduate training and expertise in public health, implementation science, and health systems research. He is a PMI certified project management professional with over 12 years of progressive experience in global health, health system strengthening, community and primary healthcare, and health program management. Dr. Ibrahim is one of the pioneering PhD holders in the field of implementation science in Africa, having been awarded a fellowship of the World Health Organization's special program in tropical disease research. Dr. Ibrahim has published over 30 peer-reviewed papers in his field of expertise and is a regular conference speaker at various conferences across the globe. He has worked as a clinician, program manager, researcher, advisor, and consultant at both government and non-government organizations in various African communities, as well as in Europe and North America. He is currently a research associate on global mental health and an implementation science specialist at the University of Alberta in Canada, as well as an associate editor with the BMC Public Health Journal. Dr. Ibrahim is a member of several global implementation science and health systems networks, such as the Society for Implementation Research Collaboration, the Nigeria Implementation Science Alliance, and Health Systems Global. Secondly, we're joined by Dr. Stephen Manshishi. Dr. Manshishi holds a Bachelor of Science degree in Biological Sciences from the University of Zambia, a Master of Science in Neuron Physiology from the Northeast Normal University in China, and a PhD in Reproductive Neuroendocrinology from the University of Cambridge in the United Kingdom. He currently works as a lecturer and researcher in the School of Natural Sciences at the University of Zambia, with an interest in basic biological science research, particularly in the neuroendocrine regulation of the reproductive system in mammals. Dr. Manshishi is also interested in promoting science, technology, engineering, and mathematics in Africa and Zambia in particular. He co-founded and directed a mentoring network, the Junior and Seniors Mentoring Network in Zambia. He also served as Zambia's ambassador for the Next Einstein Forum from 2017 to 2019, and is a member of the Next Einstein Forum's community of scientists. Thirdly, we're joined by Dr. Catherine Kaya-Butungi. Dr. Kaya-Butungi holds a PhD in epidemiology from the University of Heidelberg, a Master of Science in Community Health and Health Management from and a Master of Science in Community Health and Health Management from the same department. She is the Executive Director at the African Population Health Research Center, where she was formerly the Director of Research and has served the APHRC in several leadership roles over the past decade, having joined as a postdoctoral fellow in May 2006. Prior to her graduate studies, Dr. Kaya-Butungi studied medicine at Makerere University in Kampala, after which she worked as a medical officer at Rushere Hospital, a rural health facility in Western Uganda for 3 years. Before and during her graduate studies, she was an assistant lecturer and later a lecturer in the Department of Community Health at the Mbarara University of Science and Technology, where she was part of the response team during the Ebola outbreak in Uganda. Dr. Kaiwa Tungi has served on numerous boards, panels, and expert groups, including the In-Depth Network Board of Directors and the Advisory Council of the Carnegie African Diaspora Program at the Institute of International Education. She was also the inaugural chairperson of the Kenya Epidemiological Association. Her research interests include migrant health, community participation in health, and the epidemiology of non-communicable diseases. For the run of show tonight, each panelist will speak initially on the topic for 5 minutes, and after each of their individual presentations, there will be a further 5 minutes for the panelists to discuss between themselves. The panelists will also be speaking in the order that I introduced them earlier. Following the presentations and discussions, there will then be around 30 minutes dedicated to answering questions. If anyone in the audience would like to ask a question, you can put that publicly in the Q&A functionality at the bottom of your screen. Feel free to send through any questions as and when they arise. Fantastic. Thank you again to our panelists. And Dr. Ibrahim, would you like to take us away?
Oh, thank you very much, Devon, and to the organizer as well. I'm glad to be here to give my little contribution to the topic, and as well, I appreciate the co-panelists as well. So quickly, I'll just share my screen and give my brief presentation. Okay. So I came across this publication. I think it was published just a couple of weeks ago, and I'm sure some of us have seen this as well. It's a Lancet paper that calls for reforms in global health publishing. And some key things that came out of that paper, among other stuff, were that researchers in low and middle income countries are often excluded and marginalized as authors in global health publications, and are underrepresented within editorial workforces, and often recipients of unconscious biases that editorial decision-making process that affect editorial decision-making processes at various journals. So I would want to share my own experiences and choices, both as a researcher, an author, and as an associate editor with the BMC Public Health and guest editor for various other journals. Now, I would just say this, that for me, in terms of where I've published, I've gotten, I think about 13% of my publications have been in African journals, and about 93% have been on PubMed. So I'm just giving the reasons, some of the description of my choices, so to speak. And what has informed my choices as an author? A lot of times it has been about information about the journal itself. So what's learn that this journal exists, learning about the scope of the journal, and several other attributes about the journal itself, including the things like the scope. And I've also been, I think, to a large extent, been influenced by self-perception of competence, right? Over my short publication career, this has improved over time. And I said it's not necessarily, it doesn't necessarily have to do with the quality of work, but I think this affects a whole lot of African researchers as well. When you start off, you have this idea that you can't go big, and so you want to start small. But essentially, I have found that even though my self-perception of competence has increased over time, publishing and articles, it's not necessarily quality of work. So my earlier quality of work may or may not have changed that much, but to influence my choice of journals. So I think some of the papers I published in local journals probably would have also gone for journals overseas. I don't want to use the word international in this context because I think we should begin to perceive our own journals in Africa as international. International simply means it goes beyond one country. So quality, I think, has not been much of the issue, but self-perception of quality or competence. And then the acceptance rates of these journals, publication fees have been also very important in making these decisions. And the target readers. So sometimes I also think that some papers are targeting a specific audience. And so I would look for journals that seek to reach those, reach that audience or that readership. There's also the issue of peer perception in academia. So I've worked as a clinician, a policymaker, a program manager, and also as an academic, also within academia. And I find that with respect to academia, when I got into academia, I found that there has been that there are certain things that determine how your work is perceived. So not necessarily the quality of work, but the perceived quality of work. And sometimes it's influenced by certain criteria which are not objective, in my opinion, like impact factor of journals and the perceived prestige of the journal. So those things also inform my choices as well. So what has been my observation as an editor? I find that many African submissions are of competitive quality, contrary to what many believe it to be and many perceive their own work to be. But unfortunately, many African manuscripts seem to undergo far more scrutiny than non-African manuscripts. This often has been the result of some preconceived notions. There is that perception from outside Africa that there is far less capacity. I'm not saying that there are no capacity challenges, but often when people see submissions from Africa, there is that unconscious bias. Also poor understanding of the African context as well. So I have found in my own experience, both as an author and as an editor, that many times you find that I've written, for example, I've written several papers and in which I've been asked to go back and resubmit with further details about the settings of the research beyond what would be required from authors of other jurisdictions. So some of my papers, you find a whole lot of content describing the health system in Nigeria, the governance system, the political governance, just to make the international audience understand the context better. But this is not the same when it comes to some other crimes. I did a recent systematic review, and I found, and in doing that, I was amazed that negatively that certain papers, particularly from the United States, did not even state the country of origin. So it was difficult for me to do my systematic review. I would have to search the authors. They'll just simply state that we got the data from the national database of veterans, and I don't know what country that is. So the assumption usually with journals is that, given that they're from the West, they assume, they just, there's that, once they understand the context, which is their own context for most editors, it's assumed that it's understood generally. So I think those are the issues. And so African authors have to do a whole lot more work. But then there's the positive side to it, in the sense that that excess scrutiny perhaps brings a whole lot more really stronger papers and better understanding of the African context, and brings African work to better play in the international context. And there are financial barriers as well, article processing charges, and stuff like that have been a real issue with the choices that African researchers face. And there are also psychological barriers where I recall I had a chat with an author recently, and he was telling me that he had this very beautiful review paper, and I was like, wow, why don't you submit it to the BMC Public Health? And he said he felt he should start small. He's thinking that it might be rejected. So that psychological barrier also exists that needs to be broken for Africans to know that a whole lot of African submissions are globally competitive, and poor quality of work is not an African thing. It's ubiquitous across all jurisdictions. So we can actually aim high or aim broader. I won't use the word high as well for some other reasons, in sense that I don't really agree with lots of the criteria for choosing what's high and what's not high. So accessibility as well to publications also determined, because lots of authors in African institutions are unable to, lots of African institutions do not subscribe to certain journals, and so that also influences where they publish as well. So these are some of the things I've observed. So finally, I will just make some few suggestions. I think we would, during the discussions, would dig deeper into this. The choice of journals should be based on target readers, I think, and your career plans, because I think publication is not just about science, it's also about career. So if you're in an academic setting that requires certain in quote standards, which may not necessarily be standards. So for example, impact factor or prestige, which are not objective, but you think that would advance your career, then it's important you target those journals. Then demands of your employer or the sector, and the visibility of your work. So I think that often publications are sometimes for scientific purposes, some are for academic purposes, some are for practice. For example, industry, some are even for political purposes. So I think the purpose of your work will determine where you publish. So I think those should be put into consideration. And I think African researchers should not hesitate to publish overseas, but also should not underrate good local journals either. I think good and bad quality journals are found all over the world, irrespective of what country it is. Very importantly, I think African researchers should look for opportunities to collaborate both locally and internationally. This is important in the sense that such collaborations will tend to improve the quality of work, will tend to improve visibility of work, and there is also the opportunity for knowledge and capacity diffusion across parties, collaborators. Thank you. I think that's my brief presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Ibrahim. Dr. Manshishi or Dr. Kabutingi, would either of you like to respond to that, or are you happy for us to move forward?
Speaking for myself, I think I'm happy to move forward and continue the conversation forward on the presentation.
Fantastic. All right. Dr. Kabutingi, are you happy with that?
Yes, I think I'll just say from some two interesting insights from the presentation about the self-perception of competence. I think that's an interesting one. And I think it goes to the cultural barriers that people have. So once you're confident in your ability, you don't need validation, by an impact factor of a journal. And so I think it's an interesting one, and maybe some good advice for early career researchers. And then the other one was about the target audience. And I think at the end of the day, you should ask yourself, who should read my paper, or who cares about my paper? And that can be a good, sort of metric, a good factor in determining where your paper should go. Because the Lancet might be a very good one as far as your career is concerned, but then nobody ever gets to read it, and yet you want your paper to be relevant, perhaps to your local, health official or something like that. Yeah, I think that's all I'll say.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. Yeah, then in that case, I think Dr. Machisi, you can continue with your presentation, please.
All right, so just beginning to share my presentation now. All right, so I just thought in my 5 minutes of this discussion, I'll just kind of go through what I think are the reasons why we should publish, or why researchers publish, and where they publish their research. Yeah, so I just did what I think is the ideal reasons why researchers should publish, and in reality, what is actually obtaining on the ground. Looking at this audience, I don't think any of these is very new to you, but I just thought, just as a beginning of our conversation, maybe we should go through these points. So ideally, we do research, and the reason we publish is really to communicate the new findings of research. This is important, and this actually ties into the previous speaker who did say about most of these things. So normally we publish new findings for the sake of informing fellow researchers or researchers elsewhere to try and shape the future of research in the field. So that whatever we have researched, whatever we have found out, somebody can then come and build on based on the information that we're sharing with others. Also is meant to inform decision makers and policy makers. So that is the reason, because once we find out these findings in our research in the laboratory, we don't need to keep it. We are mostly doing research not for ourselves, but it's meant to drive an agenda. So for us to get that information out, we need to inform the policymakers, and it's through publication that policymakers are informed. We also publish as a precondition from the research funders. So the research funders actually predetermine or put that as a condition that when you get this funding research grant or whatever it is, there is a need for you to publish as a way of showing that you did make use of the research fundings into good use. We also publish as a partial fulfillment of our academic journals. For example, if you need to get a degree, you need to get a PhD, you need to get a master's degree. In some institutions, it's a precondition that you have to publish a certain number of research articles. So that's the ideal thing. But in reality, some of the reasons why we publish in reality are slightly contradictory what is in the ideal situation. Others are not very contradictory. And as you see on my list, I've put the last two in green. Of course, then they're slightly contradictory to what is the ideal world, but they're not bad. So in reality, most of us, or most of the people, actually publish for self-recognition. So other than just informing, we are also trying to recognize ourselves for various purposes, for various reasons, most of which is to secure a job position, for example. Publication is really very good for one to advance on their jobs, as well as their institutions to be recognized on their CVs and everything in those lines. So where do researchers publish? Ideally, we are supposed to publish our research in journals that are most likely going to be accessed by our target audiences. So these will be most of those journals that are accessible to your target audience. So the ideal thing is to first identify your target audience and then publish in those journals that are accessed. In addition to just the scientific journals, there's also need, ideally, to publish in the mainstream media and through conferences, because we know that not every lay person or common person reads these scientific journals. So there's that need to publish everywhere if you really need your findings to be widespread. However, in reality, there's very little effort made in publishing in mainstream media or through conferences. Most of the researchers keep their findings as a very tightly guarded secret until they do publish in their scientific journals, for reasons I've already said on the previous slide, because they want to attain prestige to themselves and secure a very high impact CV for themselves. So also, rather than going for the most accessible or most accessible target journals for your target audience, we mostly go for what is perceived as the most prestigious, as Jemo has just spoken about the perceived prestige, which is not a very good measure in most of the cases. And we also end up publishing in predatory journals rather than open access journals because of this panic or this burden. We want to publish in something that is guaranteed of a publication rather than open access. And also it ends up also as a result of funding, as he already explained. Now, publishing in Africa, of course, when you search literature, there's very little publication emanating from Africa, in Africa, and the reasons are pretty much what he has already explained, what Gemma has already explained, and what I've said on the previous slides. The reality and the ideality, there's not really a match, because what I think we need to do to publish, to attract more publications from Africans in Africa is to make sure that the quality of research is improved. And if we fund research and then we get high quality results, high quality materials, I think we'll not be far off from attracting more publications from African researchers within Africa. I think I'll end here for the pre-discussion presentation, then we'll continue the discussion as we go on.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Munchishi. Dr. Ibrahim or Dr. Kabusungi, would you like to add anything or discuss on that point, any of those points?
I mean, I think I like the idea and the reality. Sometimes, you know, reality means good intentions, and many times we fall to the system that exists. So, I mean, it's just interesting to see that in spite of our good intentions, sometimes we fall to the forces. Yeah, I found that interesting. And it's not, I don't think it's unique, actually, because, you know, all of us, we say, yes, I want my paper to be read, but then you publish it in the Lancet, then you don't want to do the blogs. The blogs, you think they're not important, and yet maybe your blog is what could have been read by the policymaker that you wanted to target. So there's always that tension and contradiction in the ideals and the practice.
Yeah.
Yeah, so then from what Catherine has said, I think, most times, like most times, we assume that that publishing in a journal or a prestigious journal would definitely catch the attention of policymakers. But I've been on both sides of the divide. I've been a policymaker in Nigeria, and I've been an academic, and I realized that often, like Catherine said, the blogs and the news, the mainstream media, are often more impactful in policy, in influencing policy than academic journals. Often when policymakers want to refer to journals, they often go there not to seek evidence, but to get the kind of evidence to support notions or decisions they have already made. So, so I think, yeah. So I think that should also come to the consciousness of people who want to make impact. That it's not necessarily the prestige of the journal that determines the decision making by policymakers. Then the other concept, which I think perhaps we would further, I think it's going to come. I've seen one question in the Q&A relating to that as well. It's the issue of predatory journals. I think we're going to flog that issue over and over here, perhaps, because in my opinion, 99% of journals are predatory. It only depends. I mean, it's just who is the prey. That's the question. Where you have a situation where you have journals operating businesses, irrespective of their impact factor, making a whole lot of money, and researchers have to pay, and reviewers do this work for free, then we wonder which journal is not predatory. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, everyone, for that. I think we can then move on to Dr. Kaya Butungi's presentation.
Okay. So thanks very much. And I put on very many hats, and even in the introduction, I think this hat was omitted in my bio, because I actually direct or co-direct a PhD training program called the Consortium for Advanced Research Training on Africa. And so clearly with PhD, you have trainees, people are trying to, where publishing is important, either as a requirement for the academic qualification, but also, as their path towards growth as researchers. So I decided to share our experiences, and in a way, I try to flip what the challenges are into what we are trying to do and what challenges we're trying to address. So that in the end, trying to connect why do we do what we do, and how has that actually panned out when it comes to our success in this PhD training program. So I'll talk very briefly, just one slide about CATA, which is a Consortium for Advanced Research Training in Africa, and then what we're doing to support scientific publications for early career researchers who are beneficiaries in this program, and then why we do what we do. And then just one slide on our experiences. I had more slides, but then I was told I have only 5 minutes, so I had to take most of them out. So just a very, very high-level overview. It's a consortium of universities, 8 of them, and 4 research institutions in Africa. And it's aimed at strengthening research excellence and productivity. So we are targeting faculty who don't have PhDs and researchers in the partner institutions who don't have PhDs, and they are the only targets. So they're the ones who can benefit from this initiative. It's a 20-year program, because ultimately we want to change the environment in which, in the academia, how research is practiced, the culture, but also the emphasis and priority research is given in our partner institutions. And so we support several early career researchers in different capacities, including PhD training, and recently including postdoctoral training, because now we have 104 graduates from this program. So now they need further support to grow into their career. So what we do to support publications, we strengthen capacity in cross-cutting research skills, because that is actually where it all starts. That if the research is poorly designed, if the study design was bad, if the sample size was inadequate, it doesn't matter how beautiful the paper is, it may never get published if the right methods were not used for analyzing the data. So we tried to go across the whole continuum of research, from conceptualization to design to data management analysis, and then finally scientific publication. And through that, academic writing, literature review. So all these skills are there, because in the end, the final product is a function of the process, the whole value chain of science. So we do that. And then other than that, we provide continuous support, because realize if you're an academic in a university and you go for a training, let's say on scientific writing, when you go back, you have to teach, you have to do a lot of things. So sometimes what you learned in class does not pan out in practice. And sometimes it's hard to connect what the data analysis has to do with the writing. So we try to have a cohort approach, and we provide remote mentorship even after the training, so that our fellows can go through and actually finish the papers they're supposed to finish. And then we have what we call protected time. That's a huge challenge. All our fellows are full-time faculty or full-time staff at the research institutions. So having time where you can actually sit down and write papers is not easy when you have to teach and you have all these other responsibilities. So we have a mechanism through which people can protect their time. We have 4-week residential seminars before COVID. Now we are doing them differently, but during those 4 weeks, you can actually come analyze your data, you can actually come write a paper, you can actually come and conclude your literature review. So that when you go back home and with all these other competing interests, you're able at least to make some progress. And then really something which is very critical, I saw some questions about predatory journals and all that, policies and guidelines on scientific publication, so they understand the publication landscape, because sometimes that's where problems come in. And then of course the financial support, the fact that publication is very expensive, especially if you aim at open access. So we provide actual financial support to the fellows so that they can get their papers published. So I wanted to focus a little bit on understanding the publishing world. So this has to do partly with publication ethics, but it also has to do with understanding the system that one needs to navigate. So we do things like definition of authorship, so issues around token authorship or gift authorship, who is an author, who is not an author, because We see publication as a mark of credibility and as a mark of experience. So if you've been gifted publications, you're sort of a fraud, like pretending that you have expertise that you don't have. So that is a good understanding, so that people understand why do you need to be a first author and what is your role, so that you actually internalize that role, so that you learn the publication process. And then the other thing we talk about is around plagiarism. That's a huge factor. Sometimes papers get rejected because every single journal has plagiarism checks. And if you don't institutionalize, that, then you send the paper and they send it back just because they put it in software and it's spit out 30% or 60% or whatever it is. So just beyond the exposure to some of these practices, most of them have been institutionalized. So all our partner institutions now, like, for instance, have Turnitin, like nothing gets published, nothing gets submitted unless it has gone through, that process. But beyond that, we have actual training. Our fellows undergo 9 months remote training in academic writing. And the output of that is their literature review chapter for their dissertation. But a lot of the emphasis is on plagiarism. So you do literature review, you write it up, and then there's somebody who takes you through, this is how you rephrase, this is how you synthesize, this is how you present, so that when your paper eventually goes out, it's unlike, even if you put it into Turnitin, it's unlikely to come out as plagiarized, because you're given the skills around how to synthesize knowledge and put it out there in a way that shows an understanding of the literature rather than a copy pasting of the literature. And then there's this other platform, which is called Think, Check, and Submit. And that's where the issues of predatory journals, from where we sit, that's where they come, because it's an initiative to try to pick out journals which are purely there to get your money. You submit a paper today, it gets published the next day. It's not reviewed. And many times they are not indexed. So even after you publish, no one will ever see that paper except you. So you put it on your CV, but it may never be seen by anyone. So this is an initiative also which we have institutionalized. It's a way of checking whether the journal is predatory or not, according to those that are purely there to get your money, but they're not there to advance science. People have published papers that just have one word repeated, in 20 pages, just one single word, and it gets published. So those kinds of journals, they can be, sort of picked out by this approach. And then we emphasize open access, because open access, much as there are challenges in terms of cost, but ultimately, when we're talking about who is our audience, who should see our paper, once the paper is open access, and I've seen questions about where should I publish. If you can publish in an open access journal, it means any single person can see that paper, they can read it. So if your aim is for people to see your paper, people that matter, but also that the paper is citable and discoverable, then we have a sort of an open access, guiding principle. But then the other aspect is to be able to navigate the open access processes, so you don't submit your paper and then 6 months later, they tell you to pay $2,000 and you don't have it, and yet you wasted all this time. That you know when to negotiate, when to not negotiate, when to pull out, when to retrieve the paper. So it's just understanding the whole environment, so that the chances of success are very high when you submit your paper. So why do we do what we do? As I've said, when you strengthen capacity in cross-cutting research skills, we are trying to address the challenge of limited capacity and skills to publish, but also skills to conduct good research. Because once you lose it at the conceptualization phase, it's unlikely that you'll succeed at the publication phase. And then, of course, the continuous support. I mentioned this, that sometimes putting theory into practice, one-off training can become problematic when you're alone on your desk. Then everything you learned can fly out of the window. So we try to provide support so that people can actually go through the process. I talked about the protected time, lots of competing interests. And then the lack of understanding of the publication environment. So we try to have all these policies and guidelines so people know how to navigate it. And then last but not least, the issue of unaffordable financial support. I had a table which I took out, but we've spent more than $270,000 in the last 5 years providing money to our fellows to be able to publish their papers. So there's no single fellow who can say I didn't publish because I didn't have the article processing charges. And the range is from $180. The most expensive is more than $4,000. But then what it shows you is that our fellows have published more than 1,100 papers. It shows that not all papers people pay article processing charges. And the reason for that is because people understand they're able to negotiate and get exemptions. So that's for early career researchers, depending on where you are, it's possible to get your paper published without cost because you understand the process, you negotiate at the right time. And if it's not possible, then you find somewhere else, to put that. We do a lot of monitoring, and then it informs our interventions. This is a slide on non-indexed journals. The problem with non-indexed journals, people who follow the traditional route of finding literature, if somebody went to PubMed, if the journal you publish is not indexed, your paper won't be in PubMed, so they won't find it. So non-indexing is more, if a journal is indexed, it's likely to be more discoverable. And we emphasize discoverability, but both by fellow academics, but also by other users, of your paper. So you can see a huge shift from around 45% of papers being published in non-indexed journals in 2011, when we took our first cohort, to about 9% in this year, of course, but really around the 20% mark. And one of the reasons for this is because some of our partner institutions insist on people publishing in local journals, national journals, so as part of promotion requirements. So it is still there, but we at least moved from the very high point where we started, and our aim is to take it a little bit lower, because actually some of the partner institutions have changed their requirements, and you can still get promoted without publishing in a single national journal. So those are some of the things we've seen, but really what we've learned is that early career researchers face huge challenges before they can successfully publish. And you need a holistic approach to publication. It's not just, pay money. And many times this requires institutional commitment to adopt policies and procedures, but also it needs resources, especially money. That's all I had, and I'll pause there and I'll be happy to take questions.
Thank you, Dr. Kawatungi. Are there any comments from the rest of the panel?
So from my end, I think I'll first of all want to, if I'm visible, I want to give an applause to APHRC. Yeah, in the sense that not just because of your presentation, but I think APHRC has done a whole lot of work to strengthen research, and a whole lot of people, including and particularly myself, I think I've benefited a whole lot from the work that you've done at APHRC, I must confess. And so that being said, I think it's gone a whole long way to strengthen research practice and capacity in Africa. And I think it would be a fulcrum for building systems and structures that would enable Africans publish a whole lot more. I see, for me personally, I look forward to a time where a whole lot of African work is published in Africa and visible across the globe. Now, again, back to the issue of predatory journals. I'm a controversial person, so I want to go controversial. Yeah, there are lots of crap journals out there that just are out for your money, but there are also lots of good journals that go through peer reviews. But unfortunately, because they're not well financed or not recognized outside the continent, they are just tagged predatory. And I look forward to a time where we as Africans are able to build, perhaps create a system that is that suits the African purpose and maintains quality. And I see a whole lot of work that APHRC is doing can perhaps lead us there. Because, for example, the British Medical Journal is actually a local journal. It is British. So why should it be considered so much different from perhaps the Nigerian Medical Journal? Yeah, and back to that again, in the issue of indexing, I have one interesting experience. One of my, I think, the first paper I actually wrote, published, I was just a co-author on that paper, was published in a journal which is not indexed. I think it's probably indexed just in the African Journal Online, AJOL. It's not on PubMed till today. That was my first paper. I was just called to collaborate, and I was so excited to do that at the time. But the interesting thing is, looking at Google Scholar, it happens to be my most cited paper. And then looking at ResearchGate, it's my most read paper, and I still don't understand that phenomenon today. I mean, it has had over 35,000 reads, and I don't understand how that happened. So I think perhaps there are certain other factors that that determine the visibility of a journal beyond indexing. I think it's important to look into that.
Fantastic. Dr. Manchishi, would you like to comment on the presentation? I think you're muted as well. Thanks.
Okay. Yeah, sorry about that. I just wanted to say that was a very beautiful presentation, and that's a lot of good work you're doing in trying to advance publications among your PhD scholars and other academics in your institutions and around surrounding institutions. But I just wanted to find out, looking at the fact that we're trying to answer the questions of whether Africans should publish in African journals and so forth, you did say that your rate of publications in non-indexed journals has gone down. So in a way, and we know that most of the unindexed journals are African. So in other words, most of African journals are not indexed. Are you in a way then encouraging your students and staff to publish outside Africa where we have more indexed journals?
I mean, I think our approach is open access, because it doesn't matter where you are. If you have internet, you can get a journal that's published anywhere in the world. So really the only principle we have is open access. And because at the end of the day, knowledge should be for a purpose. You shouldn't just publish a paper because you want to add it on your CV. You should publish a paper because you want people to find it and read it. So that's really the main consideration. And the reason why we discourage non-indexed journals, as I've said, is because they're hard to discover. If you Google and the journal maybe has a website, it's possible to find it. But I think you also had a slide which says, sorry, there's, something is happening. That's quite common when the journal does not have a website, or it has a website. You have to go through so many steps to actually find the paper. And if somebody else could have easily Googled, and because the paper was open access, they would find it. So really the only consideration is open access, and the non-indexing is because those two tend to go together. If a journal is non-indexed, then it's unlikely to have all these other infrastructure that allows it, to thrive. And so the issue about predator and non-predator, really, there's no reason why journals shouldn't get indexed. It's a process, it takes time, it can take about a year, but you can find a journal which is 10 years old and it's not indexed, and there's no reason for that, really, because you're sort of taking people's papers and hiding them from, in a way, traditional ways of finding literature, but other than that, as the ways of finding literature keep on expanding, maybe indexing may not be as important. But for now, people will traditionally go to a database and they put in a search term and they do all these things, and then they come with literature, then they save and they do citation. There's a way that the databases help when you're doing your literature search. So indexing is not expensive, it's not impossible. And so it's something that it's not a mark of quality, really. It's just a procedure that makes it easier for people to find literature.
Fantastic. If I may actually just jump in with one of the Q&A questions here, because it is very connected. If the goal is to get more African publications or get African publications to a point where they're more visible, but at the same time, there's more of a direction towards open access, and that is, the goal. We want to be supporting open access publications. Is that not a barrier to entry or a barrier of growth for African publications, in the sense that open access journals either require fees to be paid up front or some other kind of investment on the side? So I'm just curious, how feasible is the open access method for African journals, and is that necessarily a hindrance to our publications? I don't know who would like to maybe go first. Dr. Ibrahim or Dr. Kaibutungi, I guess you guys have more experience on this side.
Okay, since you mentioned my name first, maybe I should go first. Controversially, as usual. I think I love open access publication, and I think it's very important, and it should be the way to go. But unfortunately, like you have said, there's a serious barrier to entry, not only in Africa, but particularly in Africa. And I think that's probably beyond the scope of this discussion, but that's what I began talking about, the fact that we need to look again at the publication model That's why I refer to the fact that most journals are predatory some way or the other, because so I think there's need to, because are we looking at science or are we looking at business? So there's need to look at these things critically, because we, in terms of science, we want a whole lot of information to be out there as possible and as accessible as possible to the general public to make decisions. But unfortunately, there is science and there's academia. Academia does not require your publications to make any impact per se. It just requires it to be published in a recognized journal. And that's where most authors who are in academia go, irrespective of what country in the world. They just want it published, right? Well, I think there is need to now revisit this model and see how we can actually advance science. I don't know how that's going to work, but it's something that needs to be looked into. But in the meantime, in Africa, I think we need to think about how to, what are the opportunities available to make open access publishing more accessible to the African reader and the African researcher. I don't have the answers. I think these things have been discussed over and over and over again. And I really don't know what the answers will be. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think as Ibrahim said, the open access is a double-edged sword. It was intended to sort of democratize knowledge and make it more accessible. Then it's ended up being a business model that perhaps creates lots of barriers and is sort of exclusionary of certain voices, from publication. So it's something which I think is being recognized. But then there are also several initiatives to come up with different models of publication. But I think even in this whole shift towards new models of publication that are not so business driven, I think African journals are still being left behind, because ultimately, really, we need to look at publication as a business whose product is knowledge, or maybe whose product is something like you're not producing mobile phones or something like that, but it's still a business ultimately. And I think some of the African journals suffer from that, not recognizing that it's a business and it's a different business operating environment, because the open access movement came and swept over everything. So previously, where somebody would have considered publishing their paper, let's say in the a journal that is run by the university where they are, now if that journal has to survive and give the papers as open access, then it needs article processing fees. So somebody will judge, should I pay $300 to my local journal? Should I pay, should I go and negotiate a free publication somewhere else? So I think the African journals also need to realize that it's a different operating environment, and then try to run journals as a business. But then also try to find business models that are not exploitative. So, I mean, just giving some examples that, there are models where, for instance, it depends on institutional subscription, or it depends on individual subscription, and somebody has to work through this. Businesses, people do scenarios, they project, they bring economists. Somebody needs to sit and say, okay, if there are 20,000 universities in Africa and each of them pays me $100 for my journal, what's going to happen? And then do it that way. But without this business mindset behind the journal management and publication, perhaps it's going to be difficult. And maybe 10 years from now, there'll be studies that show that open access actually killed African journals. And I don't think it will be a huge surprise.
Dr. Machishi, would you like to add anything there, or can I move on to the next question?
Well, for the sake of time, let's move on to the next question and probably pick it up from there.
I mean, I think maybe I'll pose the next question to you first. Then, in that case, is given the fact that the difficulties you have mentioned, then, and even from the journal perspective, the kind of difficulties they faced. Can you see any potential ways for African academics to publish within the continent while still obtaining the same spread on their work? So, for example, Dr. Kaibatungi referenced earlier, the importance of blog posts. There's also been, an increase in the spread of work through social media, so people sharing works on Twitter, and then also open more kind of archival websites that are then, public and don't require peer review. The question is, what are some of the other strategies that a student can maybe use to spread their work while still supporting the African academic system?
So yeah, I was saying the fact that we can differentiate between business and information dissemination, there are various ways in which we can disseminate information without having to worry about publication fees and so forth. But the fact that there is also a business aspect, that's what draws that aspect back. Like you said, there's a blog posts, for example, there's conferences and so forth. Actually, what I think is more impactful on the African continent in terms of this dissemination of our research findings is through conferences and national or either national or regional working groups. So for example, if there's a particular field of study that one is interested in, the more effective way of communicating the findings is through conferences and national or regional working groups. That way you can have a conversation with peers and so forth, and other policymakers probably brought in the same room. You can have a very effective conversation, even more effective than it is with journal publications. And the other aspects of disseminating information, if you're just focused on academics, disseminating your findings, but that could be through the archives and or the blog posts, as she already said. The only drawback, like I said, in my ideal and real reasons why we publish, that does not give you credit to a lot of credit for you to put on your CV and probably earn a high-paying job or a high-paying. I mean, it doesn't really build your CV as much as you would want to. In addition to just disseminating information, you want also to gain a stable job owing emanating from your CV and your list of publications and the type of journals that you've published. But if you put that aside and just concentrate on your academics and spreading the information that you found out from your research, I think there are many other avenues that we can use for publication.
Great. Dr. Kabatingi or Dr. Ibrahim, would you like to answer that question or chip in on it?
I think what I'll say is that
please go ahead.
Sorry, I think what I'll say is that I think with new age media, really, this business of focusing on peer-reviewed journals and we stop there, I think it's quite outdated. And so we need to find ways of mixing. And even when you publish your paper there, don't leave it there and expect that everybody's going to find it. And there are studies which show that papers which are tweeted, papers which are put on blogs or put on LinkedIn, they have much, much greater reach. People read them, people download them. And so that we need to because for me, a paper should be published because you want people to read it. So anything that can make it readable, I'd say go for it. But of course, if you want a paper to be added on your list of publications in your CV and you don't care what happens to it, then your choices are different. But personally, I'm from the perspective that papers should be published because there's knowledge that is beneficial to somebody somewhere. And therefore, from that perspective, social media and blogging and any kind of visibility you can give your paper, would be useful.
Yeah, thank you. I think I'll pick up from what Catherine has said. First by saying that she has spoken as a true African scientist, because in some other parts of the world, some other parts, the focus is not on visibility, it's on academic progression, right? So people just want to have it on journals that can be cited for the purpose of progression or for the purpose of grant applications. So I think the purpose of your paper would determine how much visibility you would want. And I think lots of work in Africa, from my experience as an African, is that African publications often push towards more visibility, which is a very, very, very good thing. And I think I appreciate that about us. That being said, we should also note, again, like I said, earlier, that there is a difference between academia and science. And recall that Thomas Edison discovered the light bulb, and I'm not aware of any publication, any journal in which he published that finding. More recently and very, which we all have experience with, perhaps, is the fact that a new system which is defining the financial system in the world, cryptocurrencies, began by a white paper released by a man called Pseudonym. We don't know if it's a person or a group. What's his name again? Sakos, it's a Nakamoto anyway, whatever. but it was a white paper. It was not published in a journal, but it was about Bitcoin. He developed the Bitcoin blockchain, and today that has led to a new financial system, which some believe will be the future of the world. So there was a whole lot of, so people were able to access that paper, and lots of other blockchains and cryptocurrencies have come up, and it's really perhaps revolutionary. So we should bear in mind that journals, scientific journals, peer-reviewed journals do not necessarily mean advancement in science, and could actually even be a limitation to advancement in science. So I think the purpose of publication is important. That given that the fact that we also have new media here today, it's an opportunity to make our work more visible. So when we publish, we should think about how to also propagate what we have published. Like I also said previously, that my first paper, which I don't know, I still don't understand how it had 35,000 reads till today, and how it became the most cited on Google Scholar. Even though it's not indexed in PubMed, it's indexed in an African platform, African Journal Online. So I think I may think that that's probably because of the visibility provided by an alternative platform like ResearchGate or Academia.edu or something. So it means that people are reading beyond just what we academics see or are used to. And it's time for us to begin to think about how to evolve and make more impact and take advantage of evolution. We don't have to stick to the old models. We need to begin to think about how we can really advance academia and advance the science and the visibility of science using newer paradigms. I think that should be a new way of thinking.
Great, thank you all for that. I think in the interest of time, I'll just ask one more question and try and wrap all of the questions from the Q&A up into this one question. So what's come up a couple of times is people are asking for at least recommendations on journals which are have a good business model, but are also accessible and are kind of just fair as best as possible across the board. And then some people are just asking for general advice and maybe any last words of advice to up-and-coming researchers. So I don't know who would like to maybe go first on that, but yeah, any advice for researchers, in particular, journal recommendations, I guess.
Okay, let me go first again. Yeah, so I think generally, I think my recommendations to researchers in Africa is like I presented earlier. First of all, do not underrate your capacity. Aim high as much as possible within purpose. So if you want international visibility, don't think that you cannot publish in the Lancet, right? I mean, if you send your paper to the Lancet and it's rejected, there are comments that will help improve your work. So that's one. And secondly, I think collaborations locally and internationally is very, very important. That will improve both the quality of work, capacity diffusion, and visibility of work. Thank you.
Dr. Manshishi, would you like to go next?
Yes. So you had I think two questions in one. The first question was where somebody who is just beginning can publish? I think there's no one answer to that. It's really field specific. I think you were talking about different fields. So like I said in my presentation, I think the best way to determine the journal that you want to publish is look at the work you are doing, look at the results you have, and determine who your target audience is, and look at the various journals and the scope of the results or the scope of the work that they publish, and see which one fits best what you have found out, rather than just going for something that is high impact. You wouldn't want to publish in Nature when Nature only has a specific scope, and your results are not really according to that scope. You probably get a rejection, and even the comments that you're going to get from there might not be very helpful because it's outside your scope and it's outside their scope. You might even get a desk rejection, which is quite disappointing. But in terms of general advice on fellow researchers who are just beginning, and I'm obviously one of them, just beginning on my lower ladder of publication, I think the best is to aim high, like he already said. So let's aim high, and let's just focus on quality of the research, rather than trying to limit ourselves that we cannot publish in a certain journal because of what is perceived as their standard. Your research at the highest quality, you can publish anywhere else. So probably this is not advice for us as researchers, but whoever is involved or responsible for improving the quality of research in terms of providing the infrastructure and resources. Once we're at par with all the other countries and continents in terms of the infrastructure to conduct quality research, I think we can publish anywhere, and our research results will be accessible to everyone else. I think that's what I would say, mostly based on quality.
Yeah, I think I would say the same, go for it. But I think the issue of scope is very important. So if the journal has the right scope for your topic, you have to read some of the papers they publish and see whether they are similar to the kind of paper you want to publish. I think that should be one of the determining factors. The danger is to go for something that is completely out of scope, and then you get what is called a desk rejection. So you don't even get feedback on what are the strengths and weaknesses of your paper. But if it's within scope, you're likely to get it reviewed. And then if it's rejected, it gets improved. And it doesn't mean when it's rejected, you aim lower, improve it, and you can aim higher or stay horizontal. So that's it. A rejection doesn't mean quality. There are many factors. Sometimes the reviewer is in a bad mood. and so, take heart, improve, and then, keep on aiming higher. But really determining the most suitable journal for your paper is part of the publication process, just as the getting it right in terms of how you write your paper, your background, your methods, and all this. Getting the most suitable journal is part of understanding and part of being successful for publishing.
Fantastic. I think that's a fairly motivational but also important note to end on. So thank you again to our panelists and to our audience. I hope this was valuable to everyone. But yeah, thank you again to our panelists for lending their insight into this important topic.